This is going to be a really interesting session because we're going to be looking at how natural history can actually save our planet. And I've got two incredible speakers here. And what they're going to do is they're going to give you sort of like 15, 20 minutes insights into natural history and their own careers. And then we're going to have a bit of discussion. And then we're going to open it up to you to ask questions. So I'm going to start off with, on your far left is Peter Kjærgaard. He is a brilliant professor of evolutionary history. He has published extensively many research areas, including anthropology, the Anthropocene, evolutionary biology, history of science, human biology, and human evolution. He's even published a few papers with me. That's how desperate he was. Peter is also the museum director at the Natural History Museum of Denmark, which is part of the University of Copenhagen. And he's overseeing and directing the building of a new natural history museum. This is incredible. I mean, this is a way of actually changing the way people see natural history and providing visitors a 21st century view of natural history. And it's exciting because it's one of those amazing projects that they are able to reinterpret natural history, the role of museums in the 21st century, and what I'm really jealous is, like many of these big projects, Peter will be leaving a legacy behind which will last hundreds and hundreds of years. He's also a gifted speaker, frequently interviewed by the media, and of course we're lucky to have him here today. We also have Dr. Paige Madison, who is one of those amazing people that combines the passion of paleoanthropological research, that's human evolution and bones to you and me, but also communicating the science behind the study of human origins. Paige is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Natural History Museum of Denmark and is examining the links between human evolution within the Anthropocene, which is this age in which humans have become the dominant force on the planet. She received her PhD in the history of science, focusing on the history of paleoanthropology from Arizona State University, because she feels it's essential to understand the process of science as much as it is to celebrate the huge big finds. Paige is currently working on designing the new museum exhibitions, particularly the Human Evolution Gallery at Peter's new flashy museum, which hopefully will open soon. And bless her, she puts up with Peter and I because we're all working together on a very cool project, a research project, but I have to confess, she's doing all the work. So without another ado, I'm going to pass over to Peter and ask if Peter could you give us 10, 15, 20 minutes introduction into natural history and why it matters?
Well, thanks very much, Mark, and it's great to see you all here and to listen to that, perhaps the answer to the question if natural history museums can help save the planet. It's a big question and it's quite a lot to ask for natural history museums. The obvious answer is if natural history museums can save the planet is no. This is something that we need to do together. We've just been through a global pandemic, probably still in it. We don't know what will happen next in that global pandemic. We're also facing a climate crisis that we've just been talking about a few minutes ago. We face a biodiversity crisis. When we look at all the sustainable development goals that the UN set up for us as global challenges that we need to face together and that we need to stand up and deal with together as a global society, there's quite a lot on our plate. All of this is something that that we share. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is if natural history museums can play a role in that, and if so, what kind of role can we do? And especially, as Mark was saying, if we're building a new natural history museums, where will that bring us? What kind of responsibility should we take? Is that different from what it was when we built natural history museums 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago? So the first thing I want to say is that natural history museums have never been more important the world is changing, and natural history museums have to change accordingly. What we have to do and what we have to see is natural history museums stepping up to the challenge and play an active role in our new reality. And in fact, that's not a new thing. I think one of the key things about successes for cultural institutions that last for decades, for centuries even, is their ability to adapt to changes in society. We think a lot of these old cultural institutions, museums, that they've been here forever, at least since the 19th century, and they've always been like that. But actually, they are still here because they've been able to adapt to the needs of society, to the needs of the people that museums are serving. Those needs are changing through history, and those needs are different today. We have to be more than we used to. We have the series of global challenges that I just mentioned and that we heard discussed in the previous session. We are facing anti-science movements that we thought we had gotten rid of 10, 20 years ago, but that is now coming back at us at full force, using social media, spreading fake news, false information. We see that in anti-vaxxer movements and all sorts of anti-scientific campaigns that are launched, undermining scientific authorities, scientific institutions, governments, democracies. One of the things that we have in natural history museums is that generally we have the public's trust. People have great faith in, when they go to a natural history museum, that they get real knowledge, they get real answers, they get the evidence. In fact, when you look at the United States, people have more trust in natural history museums than in universities. This is something that we have to treasure, something that we need to hold on to, and that we can use to create positive change. And we can use natural history museums as centers for change, platforms for informed discussions where we're bringing everyone in, where we are inclusive and we are celebrating the diversity, where we are bringing in multiple voices and are listening to everyone. Because in order to deal with those global challenges that we're facing, we have to work together. We can't leave this up to any one particular group. We need to work across our differences. And natural history museums are perfectly situated to bring everyone in as a neutral place, a neutral space for where differences can meet. And we need to focus on open science for everyone. And our scientific knowledge that we generate, that we communicate, that we also take up that responsibility of bringing it, making sure that we can bring it to use. And then we need to democratize our knowledge. We need to bring it to everyone. We have billions of specimens in our collections worldwide at natural history museums. We need to share that, share all of that evidence of how the world has changed when we've been collecting them over the centuries, share that with everyone across the globe. As I said, we can't do this on our own. I'm often asked what I think is the most important of the Sustainable Development Goals. And to me, it's number 17. It's partnerships. It's working together. And we need to do that both at a global scale and at a local scale. The previous speakers were asked what kept them, how they could be optimistic about the future. One of the things that really makes me optimistic about the future has changed over the past 2 years. To see how we've been able to work together as a global society to fight the pandemic really gives me hope in the transformative power of us, of humans, of people, when we know that something serious is going on, something that threatens and undermines our everyday lives. And this is what we're facing. So I think the next phase is that we use that transformative phase. We use that incredible power that humans have, that we have as a collective, close to 8 billion people, that we can make real change. And major museums, in my perspective, they have a major responsibility, and we need to take that seriously to create positive change for people and planet. The Natural History Museum in Denmark is one of the oldest natural history museums in the world. Our collections date back to 1600. The first museum was founded in 1620. Maybe you've seen this famous Cabinet of Curiosity of Ole Worm, but it's also a museum that has changed a lot. We are situated in the Danish capital of Copenhagen. We have transformed this museum from being a traditional, inward-looking, self-sufficient institution to be an open natural history museum that promotes positive change for life on Earth. And we're now transforming that to include planetary health and human health as something that goes together. At the very basis of this are our collections and research. This is what collections looks like, very well ordered. This is not so well ordered, old boxes. Some of these boxes haven't been opened since the 1830s when they were brought to Copenhagen. We still need to figure out what's in them. But they all carry evidence of our knowledge of this planet. And in our collections, we have everything that you can possibly imagine. One example here is our polar bear skulls. They've been collecting 800 polar bear skulls over 200 years. And maybe you would ask a question, why do you want to collect? If you have one or two, shouldn't that be enough? But actually, what we can now trace are, for instance, the heavy metals in the polar bear skulls, top of the food chain, and we can measure the anthropogenic impact on the Arctic over 200 years by looking at these polar bear skulls. So that's one of the reasons why natural history collections are important. We can see the trace that we have been making on this planet, on life on this planet, which can help us build better models for how to deal with the future. One of the ways of doing that is sharing all the knowledge that we have. We are part of a large digitization program where we want to bring all of our collections online. It's also part of a pan-European project where we all together in more than 130 institutions across Europe are digitizing more than 1.5 billion specimens that will be available for everyone, everywhere. One of the ways we work is also by educating the next generation and creating partnerships with citizens like yourselves through citizen science programs. And preparing for this talk, I was looking at the number of different citizen science programs that we have, engaging different people with different interests, young and old, and it's quite a range of different topics. One of which I will focus on very slightly is a project called Species that is combining 400 years of collections from our collections with environmental data collected by government officers and citizen scientists who are now monitoring the biodiversity in Denmark, bringing all of that together in one large database that will help nature management today and in the future. It's bringing everyone on board. In terms of the next generation, we have another citizen science project for high school students where we're bringing them into our labs to do DNA sequencing, protein research, getting them an opportunity of experiencing the front edge science firsthand, something that they would never be able to do in their high school, and connect with researchers and their data that they are looking at. For instance, archaeological samples will be part of the evidence going into real scientific publications, which generates a lot of excitement and a feeling that they are actually making a contribution and to science. Obviously, we have visitor programs, lots of things going on to engage our visitors, but we also go beyond the museum in Copenhagen. For instance, we've been doing field work in the Utungu Mountains in Tanzania for more than 50 years now. We built a field station down there. Next door to the field station, we built a visitor center, which is now educating more than 2,000 school children every year in that educational visitor center. And it also caters to eco-tourists who are coming down there. So this is one of the key things for us, is about sharing, is about providing all of that, what we do with everyone. And people like that. We're now, last year, the most visited museum in Copenhagen. And we are, even during the pandemic, increasing our visitors, increasing the public, and they come to us, not because they think it's a nice day out at a museum, but because they can relate to these issues, that we want to make positive change. They want to be part of that journey. And one of the things that we've managed is to get hold of the younger generation, the 20 to 30-year-olds, where about a third of our visitors currently are in that age group. These 20 to 30-year-olds are notoriously difficult to get to museums, but they relate to this. We're listening to them, to their cry for help, for action, that we need to do something about the planetary state. And we are taking them seriously, and that's why they come to us. And we're building a new museum, not for Mark and myself. We're building it for Paige, for her generation, for our children, to make sure that we can help the process of creating positive change. We're bringing everything together in the Botanic Garden. I'll just very briefly show you some images of our building site. It's right in the center of Copenhagen, and there are very few parking spaces for cars, but there's the great options for public transport right at the very center. Lots of bike parking spaces in that central area. As you can see, there's a lot of concrete, and actually, to my taste, too much concrete building that. And I think if we were starting today, we would do it differently. This has been in the planning for 10 years. If we should build a new museum today, the starting point would be to make it a carbon neutral, or even better than that. That would be the starting point for the architects, and just get started designing a new museum. However, 10 years ago, that was not that big of an issue. However, altogether, because we are recycling a lot of old buildings, the carbon footprint, the overall carbon footprint of the building is not too bad. And actually now it stands as an example that the government can use, that recycling old buildings are better than building new buildings. And it's beginning to start a trend in Denmark that we are very keen on supporting. We'll have 2 stories underground of exhibition space. I'll just give you a few more slides of what it's going to look like, and in all of those new exhibition spaces, what we will present is a grand perspective of our planet in the making, an integrated look at geology, biology, and climate, and human impacts, all together in one big narrative, one big story. Nature is connected. When we take a walk out in the beautiful areas around Ostrava, we see that nature is connected. But usually at museums, we are separating nature up into different disciplinary perspectives. So what we try to do in our new museum is to bring all of that together in one big story. And we are inviting everyone in, also on this journey of discovery that science is. The vision for the new permanent galleries is to take that traditional look at humans and the rest of the natural world, where we sit at the top of a pyramid, and instead look at humans as part of the natural world, see us as part of a larger system. We're doing that in 8 chapters, one of which Paige will be talking about shortly. So I will hand it over to you, Paige.
Thank you very much, Peter. Peter, I do have a question. The person who was actually doing these sort of like the first pick, you know, sort of like in the middle, was that you?
Sadly not. No,
okay.
I would. It should have been. I
just thought it was so heroic. I'm going into this building and I'm going to dig a hole on my own.
If it had been, I wouldn't have been showing that video.
Oh, okay. Paige, I'm very sorry. All yours now.
Thanks. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the ideas behind the new galleries for the museum. And to do that, I'm going to tell a story about human origins. And hopefully it gives you a little bit of a flavor of why I think it's so important to study the past in order to understand the present and make change for the future. I forgot my clicker. I had one job.
They're all friendly. Look at them. They're all relaxed. They're at a festival.
Yeah,
go for it.
It's quite refreshing when there's beer drinking happening at your talk. It's wonderful. Thank you guys for participating in that. It's great. It's great to see. Okay. So in 1925, this fossil skull was announced to the world. It was put forward as a potential missing link between humans and apes, and it was covered in newspapers all over the globe, though it was found near the town of Tongs, South Africa. Now, in these newspapers that covered it all over the globe, people tried to speculate on what this missing link may have looked like and how we could understand the bumps and grooves of its skull in order to think about our evolutionary past. There is, however, one newspaper article that I want to draw our attention to today that I think is relevant, and that is a piece from The Observer on February 8th. If we get to it. The author of the piece, referring to the skull, said that there must be some who will say that the discovery of a damaged skull in subtropical Africa makes no difference. The author admitted that the skull does not affect us materially, like the discovery of electricity or wireless, but what he told us was that the skull actually does something else. It provides us with a different type of outlook, and that is what difference this discovery makes. The author then went on to say that progress for humans on this planet means that we must really try to understand our place in the scope of things, which sometimes requires us to trace our career, as they called it, from the very beginnings, our evolutionary beginnings, all the way to the end, to the potential end. So the author said the more clearly humans see where they have come from, the more clearly they will be able to discern to where they're bound. Now, I can't be sure what the author meant by this exactly, but I imagine that this statement was meant to be a little bit abstract, maybe metaphysical of some kind. And I think a lot of us can potentially agree that understanding where we come from and how we came to be here might actually give us a little bit of a sense of self and maybe tell us a little bit about where we might be headed. So I imagine that's what the author meant. However, today I want to suggest that that author was so much more correct than they ever could have imagined. So today I want to ask the question of what can studying our past, our human evolutionary past, tell us about our ability to save our planet? And the way that I'm going to do this is to provide a brief overview of how the study of human evolution has changed, importantly, how our understanding of ourselves in that scope that the author mentioned has changed, and then what that does for the ways that we talk about science, the ways that we display it in museums, and the ways that we think about it in our actions. So I'm going to trace the human story from the beginning all the way into the future. In the very beginning, when fossils were first discovered that started to look a little bit human, the original idea is that even if humans had evolved, they still were separated from other animals by some kind of gulf, as one of the original scholars, Thomas Huxley, pictured here, mentioned. Even if they believed that there was an evolutionary reason or an evolutionary process of human origins, they still somehow saw it as separate from the evolution of the rest of nature. Huxley once said that no one is more strongly convinced than I am that whether from the brutes or the apes or not, humans are assuredly not of them. So again, humans seen as very, very separate. And this worldview actually had pretty dramatic implications for how we understood human origins, but then also how we understood our relationships with other living things. For example, at the time, it was known that creatures could potentially go extinct. This was something that actually had to be discovered scientifically. And if you think about that concept, that's pretty wild, to think that something can disappear from the planet permanently. And so Huxley's generation was one of the earlier generations to make this scientific recognition, yet they didn't feel the need to intervene, to get involved in any kind of way. Because humans were separate. Nature was playing out its course, its evolutionary course, in a different way. This is true even though they sometimes knew that these extinctions may have been caused by humans or human ancestors. So this worldview, this separateness, had a ton of consequences for the natural world. However, this worldview started to change as the discipline of paleoanthropology, or human origins, grew. So over the next century, after Thomas Huxley made those claims, the fossil record itself started to multiply, new discoveries popping out of Asia, Africa, and even Europe. And our understanding of the human evolutionary past started to change. However, there were other changes that added to this understanding of the past. New developments in fields like ecology, evolutionary biology, and even the realization that biodiversity was something complex and worth preserving all started to happen in the century after Thomas Huxley made those claims. And what resulted was a very different understanding of where humans fit in that grand scheme that the original author of the fossil in 1925 had mentioned. So what we see by about the 1970s and then up until the present day is a real integration, at least in the scientific community, of humans into the rest of nature. They no longer are thought of as separate or above, as in this picture, but really integrated. And that might sound kind of basic to some of the people in this room, but the implications of this actually are massive. One of the things that starts to happen when you start to understand humans and the human past in that way is you understand that nature is both shaping humans and being shaped by it, that our actions matter, and that nature matters to us. We are not separate. We cannot exist in a world where we're not concerned about other living things. And so that shift had a lot of really important effects, as we'll talk about today, for some of the other living creatures we were sharing our planet with, but but also it had some really interesting effects for the science of human origins. So this realization then got projected back on our understanding of our evolutionary past, and we were able to ask new questions. And of course, this is a royal we, because I was not old enough, but the field was able to ask new questions about human origins. For example, we were able to kind of switch away from a view of human origins that looked very closely at these fossils, these skulls of just our human ancestors, and to ask broader questions about the surroundings of those fossils, their habitats, their environments, and even their climates. Again, once you recognize that humans are not separate from nature, you can start to really ask interesting questions about how a certain habitat or even a climate is affecting the evolution of our ancestors. So again, these exchanges start to change the way that we investigate these scientific questions, that we even formulate these scientific questions. And in fact, in the last couple decades, a bunch of researchers, including our host today, have started to look really closely at climate and ask really interesting questions about how climate has affected the evolution of our lineage, how our ancestors responded to certain evolutionary changes and evolutionary challenges. And one of the things they're starting to find is that humans evolved in certain areas during certain times where there may have been extreme variability in the climate. So it was changing drastically in both from like warm to colder, but also like wet to dry. Lakes and rivers were changing. All sorts of landscapes and habitats were really changing in response to these larger climate shifts. And what these researchers have found is that a lot of the major adaptations that we consider really important in human evolution, for example, the ability to be up walking on two legs, may have been influenced by those changes in climate and therefore environment and habitat. And so this is really interesting because it starts to suggest that our ancestors actually evolved and potentially even thrived in times of uncertainty, of variability, I guess I would say. But why is that? It's a really big question. And of course, we can't answer it all today. Maybe we can talk about it a little bit in the questions. But I wanted to pick out one sort of example because I think it really ties to what I'll sort of end the talk looking at, our future. One of the many things that we think of as quite unique in human evolution is, of course, the size of our brain. And some researchers are beginning to suggest that this evolved at a particular time, probably due to some stress from climate. And in fact, possibly this brain is a result of social connection, which actually takes up a lot of brain space, both now and in the past. And that our ability to remember faces, to communicate in complex ways, to do all the things that we take for granted was actually an evolutionary response to climate change. And importantly, one of the things we seem to have evolved that may be tied to this large brain size is an extraordinary ability to cooperate. Humans cooperate unlike any other primate living on the planet today, certainly. The classic example of this is if you were to put a bunch of chimpanzees in a plane and fly them from Copenhagen like we did, it would not go well, I would imagine. But we are able to nicely sit in our seats and all agree that we are going to be largely cordial and enjoy the flight from Copenhagen to Prague, for example. That is actually incredibly unique. And it is something that happened at some point in human evolution, possibly when our brains did one of the big jumps in size. And now I mention this because it's something that has made us uniquely successful in terms of evolutionary success. We have a huge population, as Peter mentioned, and we have managed to populate almost every continent on the globe. So that's evolutionary success. And it seems scientists are suggesting that cooperation and social connection plays a huge role in that success. However, it is those same features that make us dangerous as far as other living creatures on the planet are concerned. That ability to move into all kinds of landscapes on every continent on the planet has knock-on effects, as we're seeing today. And so the same thing that makes us successful evolutionarily is also that we acquired during our past is also the thing that is really causing us to face the biggest challenge our species has ever faced. And so I say this all because I think there's some really interesting threads in here. If we talk about what kinds of tools that we need to address the current crisis, cooperation is a pretty big one. I think a lot of us can agree, and we heard a little bit in the last talk. And how interesting is it that that seems to be one of the things that we as a species uniquely possessed? It's like we have this evolutionary toolkit already ready to address this huge challenge, and we just need to tap into it and understand it a little bit better. So looking to the past and trying to understand how we became human actually can give us some really interesting indicators for how we face the present moment. And it can shape our behaviors moving forward. Again, back in Huxley's day, for example, in the 1860s, they knew that things like mammoths and mastodons had disappeared from the earth, but they didn't really know, or they hadn't really asked the certain right kinds of questions, I would say, of what that meant for the rest of the habitat, what it meant for other living creatures, and what it means to just lose biodiversity in general. We now have a better understanding of that, and we have an understanding that we have some of the tools to face it, like cooperation. And so, while it is too late for the mammoth, unfortunately, it's certainly not too late for some of their living relatives, like the Asian elephant. And these are the kind of themes that we're exploring at the new museum in Copenhagen. And there is a big question that maybe we can talk more about in the discussion, because I'm probably running low on time. One question is how do you communicate that in a museum? It is a little bit conceptually challenging because I think it's different from what a lot of us learned. It's still so easy to think of ourselves set up in industrial areas as really divorced from a natural world, but it's not at all the case. And so we've been exploring, particularly in our Human Origins Gallery, how we can really communicate that nature and humans are not two separate things, but are instead intricately entwined. And so far, we've come up with a few ideas, but the one that I'll mention is trying to avoid just posing these skeletons like you see on the right, separate from any context. You know, we're asking questions about, yes, the evolution of human anatomy is fascinating. If I could study one thing for the rest of my life, that would probably be it. I love it. But if we put them in context with the mammoths that some of them, like this Neanderthal, lived alongside, and we start to ask questions about what plants were around and how they were interacting with those plants, and whether their interactions had effects on those plants and vice versa, then we start to see a more holistic picture. And we also ask questions about how early humans how they sort of got impressions of this natural world and what it seems to have meant to them. And the fact that they're walking into caves, in Europe in particular, but not only in Europe, as we're finding out, and drawing things like mammoths and other creatures that they're seeing in their, maybe not everyday life, but pretty often, and they're walking into areas where those creatures don't exist, and that's what they choose to draw on the wall, tells us something about those interactions. They were closely entwined. And these are themes that we have been exploring not only in the new museum that we're building, but in a temporary exhibition that we're hosting right now for the rest of the year, which is fantastic, I think, of my entirely biased opinion. But again, asking questions about how we bring nature into the museum. And so this exhibition is about Neanderthals, but we've tried really hard to not just make it about Neanderthal bones. Again, as much as I love them, I truly do, I think they're great. But also, what sorts of ways were Neanderthals interacting with their environment, with what effects? And who were they sharing their landscape with? I mean, their caves, their fields, all of the areas that they were living. How were they consuming these animals and occasionally being consumed by them? These are all questions that we are trying to explore through our displays. And I say all of this to come back to the original question of what difference does a damaged skull make? And what I've tried to argue, and maybe some of you can let me know if I was successful at all, is that it actually makes a huge difference in outlook. And that author was so much more correct than they ever could have imagined, because yes, it makes a huge metaphysical difference, I think. I think these skulls are really powerful to make us reflect on our past. But also, what that author could not have known at the time was that the study of the human past can actually tell us a little bit about the evolution of the certain tools that have made us such a destructive species, but also given us the power to potentially change that direction and behave differently in the future. So thanks.
Absolutely amazing. So you can see why we actually employ her. I have to say, what is really exciting is just how museums are rethinking themselves for this new generation. And this I find amazing. I'm going to pick up on your questions, and I'm going to look at both of you. So if you look frightened, I'll pick on you first. So there is this problem I see, which is we talk about natural history, and then we talk about human history as if they're separate. And you were picking up on this. And it's unfortunate, we can't rename Natural History Museum something else, but how do we get away from natural history? Peter's looking scared. Good. This is good. Good question. Right.
How very kind of you to ask that question.
That's fine. That's fine, Peter.
No, I think the question actually is, how do we embrace natural history, and how do we embrace our own history, which is in our bones, it's in our bodies, it's in every single thing that we do every day. Our bodies that are defined by that long evolutionary history that Paige was talking about is defining how we act, how we do the most simple things. It's also defining our behavior. So I think it's really the key to understand why we have ended up in this situation on this planet, why we've ended up in this mess. It also gives us the power of understanding why we can actually effectively change this. So to me, it's more about embracing history. It's not about scaring people away. They've had their, either they've had their biology teacher or the history teacher, and they think that was the absolute worst of their lives ever. So I think what we need to do and what we can do at Natural History Museums by bringing everybody in, by engaging everybody, and we really need to engage everybody, is to see past those poor experiences, bad experiences in school, and see that history and nature, well, they're actually pretty cool.
So Paige, you actually set this question up so beautifully, and thank you very much. And I have to say, I do appreciate the name dropping of me. Thank you very much. I will pay you later for that.
Yeah, book cover and everything.
Yeah. But can I ask for you, how do you see us embracing natural history and making sure humans are part of that? You know.
Yeah, I think that's a tough question, honestly. I think for me, well, one thing I think that happens when you study human origins is you're at a natural disadvantage, because I have thought these fossils are fascinating forever. So I have to sort of crowdsource in order to get a better answer to this. And the answer that I've come to lately, and stay tuned whether or not it's successful, is like I've kind of tried to do today, confront it directly. Basically acknowledge that a lot of people feel still separate from nature, and they don't maybe see those interactions in their daily lives. And maybe they don't see themselves, you know, as similar to a gorilla, or at least if they see themselves similar to a gorilla, maybe not to a mouse or a bird or something else. And so I think the combination of what Peter's talking about really getting them excited about nature generally, but then also really asking them to confront that discomfort and of, you know, are we animals? What does that mean? Or, you know, are we part of nature? What does that mean? Why do we feel separate? And opening up that conversation. Because otherwise I find that, you know, if we're just told, oh, we're primates, or, you know, that sometimes that you start to see people glaze over. So, which of course I think is fascinating. So I would just, you know, ramble on about it forever, but I try to ask them like what they see. And I think conversation is really helpful there. Yeah.
I'm going to do a straw poll for you, okay? So this is audience participation now, okay? So Just stick your hand up if you actually feel close and part of nature. Oh, I love festivals. Okay, so about 70%, that's good. Okay, so I'm now going to do the Paige question. Put your hand up if you get excited about skulls in human evolution. Ooh,
That's a pretty good turnout.
Yeah. Peter, did you have your hand up?
Absolutely, I did. And,
right, thank you for the audience participation. I'm going to come back to the next question. So I've got one more question and then it's all yours, okay? You can do what you like with them, okay? So this is something I struggled with. So I work both with Peter and Paige, but I also work with the Natural History Museum in London. And one of the sort of like mantras of museums is that you go to a museum 3 times in your life, you know, as a child, as a parent, and as a grandparent. And I was fascinated that you were saying that this, and I'm looking around the audience, and they are the amazing 20 to 30-year-olds. You know, by the way, you're the holy grail for advertisers, for museums, etc. You know, you're special. Once you get to 31, it's all over. So Peter, how do you break that cycle? How do you make the museum a place that people go, actually, that's a cultural event, I'm going to go there, just like a concert or a festival?
I think the key is actually listening. The key is to invite people in and say, this is your place. And one of the things that one of the ways that we've done that is to invite the student organization in Denmark picking up the fight against climate change, the green students they're called, and they couldn't figure out where to meet. I mean, they come from the entire political spectrum, from the far left to the far right, and everybody in the middle. And all of them, they volunteered, well, we can meet at our place, but the others, they couldn't see themselves there. So we opened our doors for them and said, well, this is your place. Come in. You can have your meetings here. You can have your debates here. And they did. And one of the most wonderful moments as a museum director was sitting in on a debate that they had organized about where they invited the leaders, the young leaders of all the political parties. It's Denmark. We have a lot of political parties. I think I've lost count of it. Maybe, Paige, you want to have a go? 15, perhaps? And they were all there. And seeing that, beyond their differences, they all agreed that we need to take the fight against climate change seriously. We need to stand together to transform society, to think differently. We need to get everybody else, i.e. the 31-year-olds are not, to think and act differently, and to see that power in that room where disregarding all the political differences, but being brought together for that particular cause. That's the power of museums. That's what we can do. And I think by bringing them in, by saying, this is your place, it's just become a place that you go. You want to be there. You want to be part of this. Finally, there are someone who's listening, who are taking us seriously, and who want to be part of the change. Now, we have very briefly, we've got water on the table. One of our town hall debates, which was where we talked about sustainable development goals, we had bottled water for the speakers. And then a young woman, she raised the question, isn't that a bit hypocritical that you have bottled water? And I looked at it and said, yeah, absolutely, you're right. We don't I did it on purpose so we couldn't be criticised. Look, I got my water bottle. Yeah. Jamie's coming up next on plastics, okay, so... Exactly. Yeah. So from that day onwards, it's banned at the museum. We don't have that any longer. And so that was one example that we listen. We are making change, and I think this is really important.
can I add to that too? As a foreigner coming into Denmark, having been here now for a year and a half, I think I'm allowed, or been there for a year and a half, I think I'm allowed to fan over it a little bit. And I think coming into Denmark, one of the things I've seen is finding different ways to engage with the museum as well, so that it's not just someplace you come 3 times, but in fact, it might be a place that you can hold an event. And maybe for an American, this is, you know, much more exciting than the average European, but maybe you can have a glass of wine at that event, which I know, an open container in the United States, I can tell you, not a thing. But I mean, you know, that's gonna get different groups of people to interact with, you know, nature in different ways, or think about it, you know, just bring them in, and so that it can be more than just one thing. And we see a lot of those. And again, I bring it up in a Danish context because Denmark has really done a lot to bring art back into these spaces. And so they're almost these beautiful art installations a lot of the time as well. And so again, they kind of offer more dimensions, I think, than the natural history museums that I grew up with, which again were fantastic to me, but the rest of my family completely dreaded.
So I think we should have a few questions from the audience. And I have to say, I think one of the interesting things I think about the pandemic is that we miss things like museums. It was really weird. So like, you before the pandemic, yeah, I don't want to go to a museum. Then during the pandemic, it's like, I really miss going there. Right, there was a question there. Oh, it's Jamie. Jamie's going to ask you a nasty question. Go on.
No, I'm not. I'm going to ask a helpful question, I think. It's nothing to do with plastic. How have you addressed the issue of repatriation with the new museum? You've got all these artifacts from the Arctic and all other parts of the world. Is this front and centre?
Well, thank you for asking that. One of the key things to natural history collections is that specimens that have been collected all over the world. And to us, this is, even though this is the national natural history collection, it doesn't, the way I see it, the way we see it, it doesn't belong to the Danish people. It belongs to the world, it belongs to all of us. It's something that we share, it's the natural heritage of the world. We are custodians of it, and we are currently probably the best suited to take care of this particular part of our natural heritage, but we have an obligation to share it. And that's why digitizing it, by making all the extra data that we have, all the information that we have about these specimens, making that available for everyone, not just researchers like Mark, who would love to explore all of that big data, but to educators, to students, to school children, to small companies who can maybe find new ways of exploring biomimicry to produce new products that would make more efficient clothing, or designers, artists, anyone. This is everybody's heritage. It belongs to everyone. So the way that we are thinking about it is through digital repatriation and really opening up our collections. If there are certain items in our collection that has a significant cultural value to a significant country or a significant group of people, and they will have the opportunity of taking better care of it than we do, or equally as well care of it as we do, I would be open to say that that they should be the custodians of it. But it's really important to us that that we see ourselves as custodians and not owners.
Brilliant answer. Next question. Question right in the middle here.
Thank you. Hello. Oh, sorry. I would like to ask the projects, whether you cooperate with public really piqued my interest. But unfortunately, in Czech Republic, the museums like culture and science are chronically underpaid. So I would like to ask you if there are ways for common folk in Czech Republic that we could help with preservation as well, when there is not that likely a way that it will be supported from the institutions, not necessarily museums, but like by a government and stuff.
Brilliant question. Paige, do you want to go for that one? No.
Ooh, that's a tough one. But I'm really glad you asked it, and I'm glad that that piqued your interest, because this is exactly what we're seeing in Denmark, is that once these things are made available, people are using them, and people are filling in sort of data in this really interesting way, and everyone is learning new things in the process. But as far as really getting resources, a non-EU person may not be the best. Peter might know.
Well, I think two things. We need to think a lot more about the business of museums. We need, and one thing that I've seen is that there's you can, at almost any museum that I've visited, there are better ways of using your resources, and you need to think. You can't just think as an idealist. I'm a museum person. I love these specimens. It's great. This is all we need. But you really need to have that business mind. And maybe to a lot of us, it's super strange to think about optimizing that use of our scarce resources. But it's something that really can be done. And through that, creating more exciting offers that people will be able to pay for, even though it's very little what they're paying. This can actually, if you're making up a system that will make sure that everything you get, everything you earn will feed directly back into your museum by creating better offers. So I think there's a lot of potential there. There's been a lot of potential at our museum. We've made a complete financial turnaround by simply thinking more business-like, which was to all of us very strange. But we've done it. But more importantly, actually, I think the resources, the most important resources that we all have and we all share, is among us, is the power of what we can actually do together. That's why I mentioned citizen science. We all carry around mobile phones in our pockets. This is an incredibly powerful tool for collecting data, for connecting with people, and it takes very little, except a bit of our time, a bit of connection, and that can actually generate genuine value. Genuine value in, for instance, monitoring biodiversity, in helping educational tools for school children in rural or poor areas, and will also be a way of connecting people in the Czech Republic and Denmark and Tanzania, for instance, which would be great to see. It takes very little. It takes coordination and good ideas of bringing people together. And I think that's the real resource, and that's a huge untapped resource. It's also the resource we need to make real change in this world.
Yeah, to echo an earlier talk, make voices heard.
Absolutely.
That is one of the best tools that we have, I think, at least to get things started. And then the only other thing I'd say is, I think in a lot of these projects, we feel the need to reinvent the wheel, but I would invite you, we're happy to share more about some of those projects that Peter showed. And so taking a look at them and thinking, okay, what might be possible, or what's interesting and what might apply here, and then thinking that way. So you have something concrete to go from rather than thinking from scratch, but definitely trying to make our voices heard.
I have to say, I also think those were incredibly diplomatic answers, because I understand that we should think business orientated and we should not waste money. But I'm gonna add something here that they're not gonna say, because they're sort of civil servants, which is we should value culture. It shouldn't make money. We should at some point go, no. We need a natural history museum because that's part of our culture. Just like we need music. Just like we need sort of art. We have to actually then value that as part of society. So I'm going to say, great, I'm glad you're being efficient and I'm glad you're actually engaging everybody, but I also think it's up to us as the people to say, no, I'm sorry, I want my taxpayers' money to go there because it's something valuable. Okay? So I'm really sorry we're out of time. I'm going to take an opportunity to say incredible thank you for Peter and Paige. Brilliant expedition on sort of like natural history and why the museums are so important. I'm going to ask one important question. So, Peter, when does the new museum open?
I would invite you all to come to Copenhagen now, of course, but
Diplomatic answer.
It'll take a few years still.
So you come
Stay
now,
tuned.
come now and see the progress. So thank you very much, guys.